What if I told you that your consciousness can transcend space and time, escape the physical matrix, tap into the one true consciousness behind the universal hologram, that you can even leave your physical body? Well, if it were just me saying this, I would absolutely say, don't believe me. But the fact of the matter is, it is not just me. These statements are the product of decades of research by the military and intelligence agencies, and they are all spelled out explicitly in the now declassified analysis and assessment of the gateway process. Now, if you're just hearing this for the first time, I'm sure you, like me honestly, are thinking to yourself, this cannot be true. But it is, or at least it seems to be. And to be completely honest with you, I am way past the point of initial doubt, not just because I've done so much research on this at this point, but because I myself, as some of you know, did attend a gateway retreat at Monroe Institute just a few months ago. And yes, it was profound. Yes, I did leave my body. Yes, that is just as reality quaking as it sounds. Full story and a lot more background on all of this in this video. But back to the document itself, what does it really say? How is it really possible? What is the point of this thing? Well, those questions and many more will be answered in this very read-through, my friends. If this is your first exposure to the document, this thing is pretty dense. It approaches all of these topics, again, consciousness, transcending space and time, leaving the body, etc., from a number of angles, from the practical and theoretical to the scientific and technical. But before we crack this thing open, just a little bit of background. Why would these agencies, the military, the intelligence agencies, be interested in this topic? Why would they do this research? Well, there is, in fact, an incredibly rich multi-decades-long history behind those questions, but for the purposes of this transmission, I'm going to keep it brief. The fact of the matter is, this paper is not just some esoteric one-off. It's part of a much broader effort during the Cold War to investigate consciousness, remote viewing, psychic spying, ESP, enhanced learning, and psi phenomena in general. And if you want to know more about the history, if that just served to pique up your curiosity, I totally understand. Again, I plug this video. And also look into Robert Monroe, his books, and Project Stargate, just for starters. So with that, what do these agencies find? And does this gateway process document really hold the keys to the hidden abilities of human consciousness? Does it really allow us to peer behind the curtain of the Matrix? Well, my friends, let's find out. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and now with the timing of all of these recent revelations regarding UAP disclosure, the involvement of, in quotes, psionic assets, and how closely related it is to this gateway report, I feel like now is just such a synchronistic time to finally dive into what I think is one of the most novel, incredible documents that I've ever come across. I'm just going to get into this. I don't know how long this is going to take. I think I'll go for somewhere between 40, 45 minutes, an hour. We'll see when we get to a good place to conclude part one, but I do anticipate that this will take multiple goes. Anyway, with that, the analysis and assessment of the gateway process. You asked me to provide an assessment of the gateway experience in terms of its mechanics and ultimate practicality. As I set out to fulfill that tasking, it soon became clear that in order to assess the validity and practicality of the process, I needed to do enough supporting research and analysis to fully understand how and why the process works. Frankly, sir, that proved to be an extremely involved and difficult business. Initially, based on conversations with a physician who took the gateway training with me, I had recourse to the biomedical models developed by Itzhak Bentov to obtain information concerning the physical aspects of the process. Then I found it necessary to dive into various sources for further information concerning quantum mechanics in order to be able to describe the nature and functioning of human consciousness. I had to be able to construct a scientifically valid and reasonably lucid model of how consciousness functions under the influence of the brain hemisphere synchronization technique employed by Gateway. Once this was done, the next step involved recourse to theoretical physics in order to explain the character of the time-space dimension and the means by which expanded human consciousness transcends it in achieving Gateway's objectives. Finally, I again found it necessary to use physics to bring the whole phenomenon of out-of-body states into the language of physical science to remove the stigma of its occult connotations. So many stigmas with those occult connotations. We don't want any occult in our out-of-body and exotic consciousness research. We want it straight down the middle. Remove the stigma of its occult connotations and put it in a frame of reference suited to objective assessment. 2. I began the narrative by briefly profiling the fundamental biomedical factors of affecting such related techniques as hypnosis, biofeedback, and transcendental meditation so that their objectives and mode of functioning would be compared in the reader's mind with the Gateway process as the model of its underlying mechanics was developed. Additionally, that introductory material is useful in supporting the conclusions of the paper. I indicate that at times, these related techniques may provide useful entry points to accelerate movement into the Gateway experience. 3. Niels Bohr, the renowned physicist, once responded to his son's complaints about the obtuse nature of certain concepts in physics by saying, quote, "You are not thinking, you are merely being logical." The physics of altered human consciousness deals with some conceptualizations that are not easily grasped or visualized exclusively in the context of ordinary, quote, left-brained linear thinking. So, to borrow from Dr. Bohr's mode of expression, parts of this paper will require not only logic, but a touch of awkward page-turning mechanic, right-brain intuitive insight, to achieve a complete, comfortable grasp of the concepts involved. Nevertheless, once that is done, I am confident that their construction and application will stand up to the test of rational critique. And before we finish this kind of introductory point, I think this is really important to establish out of the gate. I mean, there's so much of consciousness that cannot be expressed, as he's saying, simply through the left brain, simply through data and scientific, materialistic terminology. I mean, consciousness itself is a holistic, subjective experience, and it does get inherently philosophical and spiritual, I think, when you wade into this territory. And I think he does a good job throughout the paper, from what I remember, of towing that line and respecting that line. 4. Paradoxically, having gone to such great lengths to avoid trying to render judgments based on an occult or dogmatic frame of reference, in the end I found it necessary to return, at least briefly, to the question of the impact of the Gateway experience on common belief systems. I did so because although it was essential to avoid attempting to render an assessment in the context of such systems, I felt that it was necessary after having completed the analysis to point out that the resulting conclusions do not do any violence to the fundamental mainstream of either Eastern or Western belief systems. Unless that point is clearly established, the danger exists that some people will reject the whole concept of the Gateway experience in the mistaken belief that it contradicts and is therefore alien to all that they hold to be right and true. This study is certainly not designed to be the last word on the subject, but I hope that the validity of its basic structure and of its fundamental concepts upon which it is based will make it a useful guide for other USA INSCOM personnel who are required to take the Gateway training or work within Gateway materials. So again, an interesting tidbit pretty much right out of the gate here. It sounds assumed that other USA INSCOM personnel will be undertaking this training, will be undertaking psychical training. All right, here we go. Introduction. In order to describe the Monroe Institute technique for achieving altered states of consciousness, the Gateway experience, involving brain hemisphere synchronization, or Hemi-Sync, the most effective way to begin is to briefly profile the basic mechanics which underlay the operation of related methods such as hypnosis, transcendental meditation, and biofeedback. It is easiest to effectively describe what Gateway is by beginning with a short description of those associated techniques that share some common aspects with the Gateway experience, but which are nevertheless different. In this way, we can develop a frame of reference at the outset which will provide useful concepts to explain and understand Gateway by comparison as we proceed. Again, we touch on the importance of philosophy, of lenses, of how to think about what's happening using other related concepts like what we're about to jump into, hypnosis. According to the theories of psychologist Ronald Stone and the biomedical engineering models of Itzhak Bentov, hypnosis is basically a technique which permits acquisition of different access to the sensory motor cortex and pleasure centers, the lower cerebral emotional portions, and the associated pleasure centers of the right side of the human brain, following successful disengagement of the stimulus screening function of the left hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere of the brain is the self-cognitive, verbal, and linear learning component of the mind. It fulfills the function of screening incoming stimuli by categorizing, assessing, and assigning meaning prior to allowing passage into the right hemisphere of the mind. The right hemisphere, which functions as the non-critical, holistic, non-verbal, and pattern-oriented component of the brain, appears to accept what the left hemisphere passes without question. Consequently, if the left hemisphere can be distracted either through boredom or through reduction to a soporific, there's a stretch in my vocabulary with that one, a soporific semi-sleep state, external stimuli to include hypnotic suggestions are allowed to pass unchallenged into the right hemisphere where they are accepted and acted upon directly. The result may involve an emotional reaction originating in the lower cerebral region, sensory motor responses requiring involvement of the cortex, and so on. Both the sensory and the motor cortices of the right cerebral portion of the brain contain a sequence of points known as the homunculus, which corresponds to points in the body. See Exhibit 1 on the next page. Stimulation of the corresponding area of the cortex uses intermediate response to the associated portion of the body. Consequently, induction of the suggestion that the left leg is numb, if it reaches to the right cortex, will result in an electrical reaction being generated that will induce the feeling of numbness. Similarly, the suggestion that the person is experiencing a general feeling of happiness and well-being would be referred to the appropriate pleasure centers located in the lower cerebral portion of the cortex of the right hemisphere, thereby inducing the suggested feeling of euphoria. Finally, suggestions such as one that informs the hypnotic subject that he enjoys enhanced concentration or powers of memory would be responded to the right hemisphere by accessing unused information storage capacity normally held in reserve as a result of the left hemisphere selection and control processes. This aspect will become significant in the context of gateway process when the attention is given to examining the way that hypnosis may be used to accelerate the progress in the early stages of the gateway experience. So this is something I definitely, thought about on my retreat, and I've thought about since, is how does the gateway process or the gateway method relate to hypnosis? Like, there's no actual outright suggestion going on as far as I can tell. I truly don't think that there's anything embedded in the Hemi-Sync tapes or CDs or MP3s or whatever form you have them in subliminally. I don't think that's how it works. I do think that there is some other form of suggestion. And I realize that by saying that sounds nefarious or underhanded, but I don't think it necessarily is. But we'll get more into this as we go. And now, still under the effort of framing, we'll get into transcendental meditation, and I guess comparing and contrasting that with gateway. On the other hand, transcendental meditation works in a distinctly different fashion. In this technique, intense and protracted single-minded concentration on the process of drawing energy up the spinal cord ultimately results in what appears to be creation of acoustical standing waves in the cerebral ventricles, which are then conducted into the gray matter in the cerebral cortex on the right side of the brain. As a result, according to Bentov, these waves will stimulate and eventually polarize the cortex in such a way that it will tend to conduct a signal along the homunculus, starting from the toes and on up. The Bentov biomedical model, as described in a book by Lee Sanella, MD, entitled Kundalini, Psychosis or Transcendence. Not a book I've read, but has my wonder whiskers perked up. States that the standing acausal waves are a result of the altered rhythm of heart sounds, which are occasioned by prolonged practice of meditation and which set up sympathetic vibrations in the walls of the fluid-filled cavities which comprise the third and lateral ventricles of the brain. In addition, according to Bentov, the states of bliss described by those whose Kundalini symptoms have completed the full loop along the hemispheres may be explained as a self-stimulation of the pleasure centers in the brain caused by the circulation of a, quote, current along the sensory cortex. Bentov also notes that, quote, that most of the described symptoms start on the left side of the body, maybe a typo here, means that it is mostly a development occurring in the right hemisphere, end quote. Although normally a period of meditation involving intense concentration and practice for 5 years or some is required to, quote, bring up the Kundalini, Bentov states that exposure to mechanical or acoustical vibrations in the range of 4 to 7 hertz cycles per second for protracted periods may achieve the same effect. Bentov cites as an example, quote, repeated riding in a car whose suspension and seat combination produce that range of vibrations, or being exposed for long periods of time to these frequencies, caused for instance by an air conditioning duct. He also notes that, quote, the cumulative effect of these vibrations may be able to trigger a spontaneous physio-kundalini sequence in susceptible people who have particularly sensitive nervous systems. So maybe this is a good moment to pause and reflect on this guy, Itzhak Bentov. I talked about him in the other Gateway video. This guy is like this multidisciplinary polymath who is an absolute genius for sure, but he's not a doctor. In fact, he's really, I think, like I said, an autodidactic philosopher and engineer. He ends up really contributing, from my understanding, to the science of biomedical implants, in particular, like catheter technology. So this is a very smart man with a wide variety of interests, and he really tries to collapse all of those interests down into an overarching theory of reality. And that theory of reality includes everything from very cosmic things like black holes and white holes and quantum theory to very localized biological things to completely psychophysical and spiritual things. I mean, in his book, if you want to get an overview of his whole theory, he has a book called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. We actually read it recently for the Third Eye Drops book club. You're going to find all of the above in there. And it has to do with some pretty familiar topics. I mean, you know, topics like resonance and sound and frequency. But he doesn't just talk about these things in a hand-waving way. He talks about them in a pretty technical way. And this is what a lot of this is hinting at, is that the body responds to different frequencies, and you can achieve different states of consciousness, including expanded states of consciousness, by altering the signals that you're putting into the brain, that you're putting into the whole, biophysical psychomatrix that is the human being. And on that note, we move on to point 4, biofeedback, and how it relates to Gateway. The third consciousness-altering methodology, which will be briefly described as biofeedback. Biofeedback is somewhat unique in that it actually employs the self-cognitive powers of the left hemisphere to gain access to such areas of the right brain as the lower cerebral, motor, and sensory cortices, and assorted pain or pleasure centers. This next sentence is a doozy. Let's give it a rip. Instead of suppressing the left hemisphere, as is done in hypnosis, or largely bypassing and ignoring it, as is done in transcendental meditation, biofeedback teaches the left hemisphere first to visualize the desired result, then to recognize the feelings associated with the experience of successful right hemisphere access to the specific lower cerebral cortex, pain or pleasure, or other areas in the manner needed to produce the desired result. Special self-monitoring devices such as digital thermometer are used to inform the left brain when it succeeds in keying the right hemisphere into accessing the appropriate area. Once this is done, the left hemisphere can then repeatedly instruct the right brain to reestablish the pathways involved so as to produce the same external objective measures of success. In this way, the pathways are strengthened and emphasized to such an extent that the left brain consciousness is enabled to access appropriate areas in the right brain using a conscious demand mode. For example, if the subject wishes to increase the circulation of the left leg in order to speed up healing, he may concentrate with his left brain on achieving that result while carefully monitoring a digital thermometer connected to the left leg. When the concentrated effort begins to achieve success, the digital thermometer will register an increase in the temperature of the left leg. At that point, the subject can mentally, left brain, associate the sensations experienced with the result achieved and can begin to emphasize by memory recall, the same process to cause its strengthening by affirmation and repetition. In this way, pain can be blocked, healing can be enhanced, malignant tumors can apparently be suppressed and ultimately destroyed. The body's pleasure centers can be stimulated, and a variety of specific physiological results may be achieved. In addition, biofeedback may be used to greatly accelerate achievement of deep meditative states, particularly for beginners with no experience in meditative techniques and whose progress in that methodology is enhanced through effective visualization and external objective affirmation. Display of the subject's brainwave patterns on a cathode ray tube has proven to be a laboratory-validated means by which subjects may quickly learn to place themselves in profoundly relaxed states characterized by a sort of quietude and singularity of mental focus associated with advanced meditation. All right, so now we're getting into some territory that I think has a lot to do with what's happening using Gateway, using Hemi-Sync, this biofeedback sort of angle. Clearly, you are creating relationships between states of consciousness and achieving certain things. Of course, when you're doing Gateway, it's not expressly to achieve any physiological effect necessarily, but it is associated with achieving different states of consciousness. You know, these focus levels, focus 10, focus 12. We'll get specifically into those as this goes on, but I think that there is a lot of similarity between what's happening with Gateway, with Hemi-Sync, and the same reason biofeedback works, you know, creating this psychophysical relationship between a stimulus and response. All right, here we go. Gateway and Hemi-Sync 0.5. And by the way, we've got a long way to go, my friends. We're only on page 4. So this is definitely going to have to be in maybe 3 parts. I didn't want to go more than 3 parts, but we'll see. Now that we've briefly profiled the basic mechanics of the principal techniques for altering or expanding consciousness, which share some objectives and or methods employed by the Gateway experience, we may proceed to focus on what that technique actually involves. Fundamentally, the Gateway experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres so as to alter consciousness, moving it outside of the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of time and space. I'm going to say that again because that's an insane statement right there. Fundamentally, the Gateway experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres so as to alter consciousness, moving it outside the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of space and time. Crazy. And these run-on sentences are absolutely bonkers, Mr. McDonald. Don't get me wrong. I've loved what you've done, sir. If you're still around, reach out. The participant then gains access to the various levels of intuitive knowledge which the universe offers. What differentiates the Gateway experience from forms of meditation is its use of the Hemi-Sync technique, which is defined in a monograph by Monroe Institute trainer Melissa Yeager as a, quote, state of consciousness defined when the EEG patterns of both hemispheres are simultaneously equal in amplitude and frequency, end quote. Although Hemi-Sync seems to be rather rare and of only short duration in ordinary human consciousness, Melissa Yeager states that, quote, audio techniques developed by Bob Monroe can induce and sustain Hemi-Sync with the Institute's basic Focus 3 tapes. She also notes that studies concluded by Elmer and Alice Green at the Menninger Foundation have shown that a subject with 20 years of training in Zen meditation could consistently establish Hemi-Sync at will, sustaining it for over 15 minutes, end quote. Dr. Stuart Twemlow, a psychiatrist and research associate of the Monroe Institute, reports that, quote, in our studies of the effect of the Monroe tape system on brainwaves, we have found that the tapes encourage the focusing of brain energy. It can be measured as with a light bulb in watts into a narrower and narrower frequency band. This focusing of energy is not unlike the yoga concept of one-pointedness, which we may translate in Western terms as single-mindedness. Dr. Twemlow goes on to observe that as the individual gets into the tapes beyond focus 3, there is a gradual increase in brainwave size, which is a measure of brain energy or power. So this is interesting. When they said focus 3, I thought maybe they meant like the 3 waves or something. But we never even did focus 3. We jumped straight into focus 10, which is the mind awake, body asleep state. So I'm not even sure. I'm going to have to go back and check what focus 3 is, and I will pop it up on the screen here, some kind of graphic indicating focus 3. All right, so that is our basic summary of Gateway. And now we're getting into the juice, because we're beginning to talk about achieving states of consciousness in which we can tap into, what did he say? Like the intuitive knowledge that the universe offers. And now, and I mean, we're already bumping up against some questions, right? Like, according to what? According to whom? What did he experience that gave him that knowing? Anyway, now we move on to point 6, lamp versus laser. Melissa Yeager uses a metaphor to help clarify the process involved in using Hemi-Sync in the Gateway experience. She points out that the human mind in its natural state may be linked to an ordinary lamp which expands energy in the form of both heat and light, but in a chaotic, incoherent way which diffuses its energy over a wide area of rather limited depth. On the other hand, the human mind under the discipline of Hemi-Sync acts after the fashion of a laser beam, which produces a disciplined stream of light. The stream of energy is projected with total coherence of both frequency and amplitude, such that the surface area of the laser beam contains billions of times the concentrated energy found in a similar surface area on the sun. I gotta read that again. The stream of energy is projected with total coherence of both frequency and amplitude, such that the surface area of a laser beam contains billions of times the concentrated energy found in a similar surface area on the sun. Gateway assumes that once the frequency and amplitude of the human brain are rendered coherent, it is possible to begin accelerating both, so that the human mind is soon resonating at an ever higher vibrational level. The mind can then bring itself into synchronization with more sophisticated and rarefied energy levels in the universe. The mind, when operating at these increasingly rarefied levels, is assumed to be capable of processing the information thus received through the same fundamental matrix by which it makes sense of ordinary physical sensory input to achieve meaning in a cognitive context. Such meaning is usually perceived visually in the form of symbols, but may also be perceived as astonishing flashes of holistic intuition, or even in the form of scenarios involving both visual and aural perceptions. The mechanics by which the mind exercises the consciousness function will be addressed in more detail later in this paper. So now we're getting into some more really intriguing territory. One, the sort of theory behind this, the notion that the more we focus the brain's energy, the more we focus our consciousness on a single pointed, literal, I guess, energy spectrum, the more the higher states of consciousness we are able to achieve. I really don't understand that point about its relation to the surface of the sun, but that's fascinating. And I guess we're also starting to touch on some of the phenomenology involved here, right? Like he says at the end here, scenarios involving both visual and aural perception, the mechanics by which the mind exercises the consciousness function will be addressed in more detail. So yeah, that was definitely my experience, just sudden visions, basically. So sometimes they would be very brief, sometimes they would be very random. I didn't talk a lot in the video about hearing voices or anything, but now that the topic has come up, I do feel like I do have memories of chatter, and this is something I've experienced too, just on my way in and out of sleep, in hypnagogic and hypnopompic states. I sometimes experience almost this like radio-y chatter, and it's not telling me anything profound, don't get me wrong. It's mostly like almost just like background noise or something. Drop a comment if this is something you've experienced. All right, frequency following response. To achieve synchronization of brain hemispheres, the Hemi-Sync technique takes advantage of a phenomenon known as the frequency following response, FFR, which means that if the subject hears a sound produced at a frequency which emulates one of those associated with the operation of the human brain, the brain will try to mimic the same frequency pattern by adjusting its brainwave output. Therefore, if the subject is in a fully awake state but hears sound frequencies which approximates the brain output at the theta level, the subject's brain will endeavor to alter the brainwave pattern from the normal beta to the theta level. This is an important point here that we definitely should review when I'm done reading this. Since the theta level is associated with sleep, the subject concerned may progress from a fully awake to sleep state, provided that he does not consciously resist, as the brain strives to entrain its wave frequency output with the one which the person hears. Since these brainwave frequencies are outside the spectrum of sounds which can be heard in pure form by the human ear, Hemi-Sync must produce them based on another phenomenon known as the brain's capacity for deducing, quote, beat frequencies. If the human brain is exposed to one frequency in the left ear, which is 10 hertz below another audible frequency played in the right ear, rather than hearing either of the two audible frequencies, the brain chooses to, quote, hear the difference between them, the, quote, beat frequency, thus availing itself of the FFR phenomenon. And using the technique of the, quote, beat frequencies, the gateway system uses Hemi-Sync and other audio techniques employing the FFR phenomenon to introduce a variety of frequencies which are played at a virtually subliminal, marginally audible level. The objective is to relax the left hemisphere of the brain, place the physical body in a virtual sleep state, and bring the left and right hemispheres into coherence under conditions designed to promote the production of ever higher amplitude and frequency brainwave output. Audible and perhaps subliminal suggestions by Bob Monroe accompany the various brainwave frequencies, which are sometimes rolled in together under sounds such as sea surf to mask the sound frequencies where desirable. In this way, Gateway endeavors to provide the subject with the tools by which he may alter his consciousness based on his own volition over time through repetitive use of the tapes so as to access via intuitive means new categories of information not available to ordinary consciousness. So yeah, this frequency following response is a really important point, a really important part of the theory of how Gateway and also binaural beats in general work. So again, to summarize it, if you want to entrain the brain with a 10 hertz frequency, that is actually not audible. So how do you do that? What you have to do is you create a 10 hertz difference by, say, playing 100 hertz in one ear and then 90 hertz in the other ear, and then using this frequency following response phenomenon of the brain, you are able to entrain your brain with a non-audible brainwave that gets you into a desirable state for meditation, basically. And of course, I was laughing because I said I don't think he's implanting anything subliminal in the tapes, but it sounds like he's readily admitting to that being part of it. And again, I know there's going to be some of you that find that to be nefarious out of the gate, but I spent enough time doing these meditations now that I truly can't detect anything that I would be worried about. Home stretch for this one, my friends. Role of resonance. However, brain coherence through entrainment to, quote, beat frequencies introduced via stereo headphones is only part of the reason why the Gateway system works. It is also designed to achieve the physical quietude characteristic of deep transcendental meditative states, which brings about a complete alteration of the fundamental resonance pattern associated with the sound frequencies produced by the human body. Yoga, Zen, or other transcendental meditation, if practiced long enough, will produce a change in the sound frequency with which the human heart resonates throughout the entire body. According to Bentov, this change in resonance results from the elimination of what the medical profession calls the, quote, bifurcation echo, so that the sound of the heartbeat can move synchronously up and down the circulatory system in harmonious resonance approximately 7 times a second. Bentov describes the role played by the bifurcation echo as follows. When the left ventricle of the heart ejects blood, the aorta, being elastic, balloons out just beyond the valve and causes a pressure pulse to travel down along the aorta. When the pressure pulse reaches the bifurcation in the lower abdomen, which is where the aorta forks to go into the 2 legs, part of the pressure pulse rebounds and starts traveling up the aorta. If in the meantime the heart ejects more blood and a new pressure pulse is traveling down, these 2 pressure points, will eventually collide somewhere along the aorta and produce an interference pattern, end quote. By placing the body in a sleep-like state, the gateway tapes achieve the same goal as meditation in that it places the body in such a profoundly relaxed state that the bifurcation echo slowly fades away as the heart lessens the force and frequency with which it pushes blood to the aorta. The result is a regular, rhythmic sine wave pattern of sound which echoes throughout the body and rises up into the head in sustained resonance. The amplitude of the sine wave pattern, when measured with a sensitive seismograph type instrument, is about 3 times the average of the sound volume produced by the heart when it is operating normally. So this is something I remember reading in Itzhak Bentov's book, this idea of basically creating coherence throughout the body and eliminating this bifurcation noise, or whatever the bifurcation echo. So again, just to summarize this, by entraining the brain with a binaural signal and going into deep meditation and getting really relaxed, you bring more resonant coherence to the whole body. You eliminate this interference pattern that happens at this bifurcation point in the descending aorta where it splits into the legs, and it creates this resonant pattern. What does he say? That's like 7 times. I'll just read it again. The result is a regular rhythmic sine wave pattern of sound which echoes throughout the body and rises up into the head in a sustained resonance. The amplitude of the sine wave pattern when measured with a sensitive seismograph instrument is about 3 times the average of the sound produced by the heart when it is operating normally. Interesting. You know, I don't know, obviously, how much of this still holds up to modern medical scrutiny, but I would really be interested to know. We're only on page 6. This is a dense document, so it's going to take a while to get through. I think that's a lot to chew on. We've already started bumping up against some really arousing. I mean, that's what binaural beats are, right? Really arousing ontological territory. We've already stated how apparently gateway allows one's consciousness to go beyond space-time, to tap in to the intuitive knowledge of the universe. I think that's pretty close to a direct quote, but there is so much more to come, my friends. We've barely let the juice loose on this topic. If you're enjoying this, you know what to do. Tickle the algorithm, like, sub, comment, share. Also, check out Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to audio podcasts. We've got a huge back catalog there. Would love to have you over on the Patreon as well. And of course, it is one of the best ways to directly support these transmissions. But you also get stuff. There's a fabulous community, patron-only Discord server, book club, Zoom hangs. Depending on your pledge level, you get rewards too. But with that, my friends, much love, and we will do the next one real soon.